Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with the top 5 list decks in the modern format for the month of October 2023, starting out at least the month here at the end of September. And I'm not going to lie, this base list is unfortunately very much like Andrea Mangucci's on-channel Fireball. Reason being is it's kind of hard to argue what the top 5, 6, 7 decks in the format are. Obviously the 5 decks we'll be covering, and then you have decks like Mono Green Tron, Hardened Scales, Amulet Titan, and then decks like Yogg and Hammer kind of at the periphery as they've kind of fallen off some in the current format. Instead, what we're going to be doing is taking a little bit more in-depth look at seeing some of the more recent additions to the decks, as well as cards that have been adopted in the sideboards to help fight particular matchups, particularly among the top decks. Now, Rakdos Scam. This deck is very familiar to a lot of people. It's been probably the top deck of the format for the last 3 or 4 months. Really ever since the printing of Orcish Bowmaster, giving the deck its other dynamic 2-drop. This deck pretty much does everything in the early game. Ragavan, Scamming Grief, Scamming Fury. Basically, if you don't know what Scam is, you pitch cast a Grief or a Fury on turn 1. You then bring it back with either Undying Malice or Not Dead After All, a new addition to the deck from Wilds of Eldraine. And what this does is either double thought seizes your opponent and leaves a 4/3 menace creature behind, or you leave a 4/4 double striker on turn 1, and if your opponent happened to have been on the play and played, say, a Monastery Swiftspear or Delighted Halfling, you leave them down board presence and leave them behind with a 4/4 double striker that's threatening to close out the game very quickly, hence where the deck gets its name Scam. The rest of the deck is a red-black rock-based strategy using things like Terminate, Bolt, Fatal Push, Fable the Mirror Breaker, and Dauthi Voidwalker as kind of ways to fight the rest of the meta or apply pressure in the early turns, as well as Thoughtseize to disrupt your opponent in addition to Grief. This deck really is dynamic in the early turns of the game. It wants to get an overwhelming advantage early in the game, kind of steamroll your opponent before they can get set up, if they're a more controlling deck or combo deck, or if they can take a somewhat controlling role against decks like Burn, Merfolk, Hammer to a lesser extent. It's very much a deck that is a traditional mid-range deck that just happens to have very powerful dynamic openings. The weaknesses of the deck is a little bit weak of a weakness to graveyard-based strategies, things like Dredge and Living End, as well as a weakness to decks like 4-color Omnath, which is kind of its natural predator in the format right now. To combat that, obviously, especially the Living End and Dredge part, you have Dauthi Voidwalker in the main deck, and then you supplement this with cards like Leyline of the Void and other cards we'll take a look at in the other build. Sometimes Nihil Spellbomb, sometimes Unlicensed Hearse. Another deck that also attacks it quite well is the Cascade deck Rhinos. So you see things like Hitsugu Kusume's All, Engineered Explosives, and Chalice of the Void to help fight on that axis. And then another card that is particularly problematic, maybe not a strategy per se, but a card that can be problematic, is the card Urza's Saga, creating big card constructs, backing it up with something like Shadow Spear to punch through damage. Hence why you'll see, in addition to it being a good hate card against decks like Tron and Amulet, and against the greedier man bases out of Omnath, it's also very good against one of the predators of Urza's Saga. So that end, you see a lot of Engineered Explosives, Hitsugus, you sometimes see Ratchet Bomb, you'll sometimes see Karn's Filigree Silex, but, basically you'll see a lot of answers to tokens, mainly out of Rhinos and Urza's Saga tokens. You'll see additional removal spells, some graveyard hate, and then some grindy cards, anti-ring tech, so to speak, things like Shouldred to play in addition to your Orcish Bowmasters. Taking in another slightly different version of the deck, the main deck is almost card for card. I think the only difference between the two is this version has a Kroxa, this version is rocking a Torok. Now, Torok is a card that's particularly good against 4-color Omnath because a lot of their answers are white-based, whether it be Leyline Binding or Solitude. So it's a card that can come down, especially on turn 4, force them to discard 2 cards, and can be very difficult for them to kill if they don't have a Fury or something readily available. But the rest of the main decks have kind of become very concise and very similar. Another newer addition to the deck is Mount Doom. This is kind of a one-of dual land. Instead of drawing cards like, something like a Sunbaked Canopy or something like that, this card instead allows you to pay 3 mana to deal 1 damage to your opponent, which could be relevant. And then you can sacrifice it in a legendary artifact, which you don't really have any, but choose up to 2 creatures, destroy the rest, activate on only as a sorcery. Could come up if you're able to steal your opponent's ring with a Ragavan or something, but generally speaking, you only use the mana ability and the pinging ability at the end of your turn. Torok, once again, card we've already kind of talked about, specifically here for the grindy matchups, primarily 4-color Omnath, which this deck is kind of terrible against overall. Leylines, we've already kind of talked about, and then the rest of the cards are all kind of cards we've taken a look at. Chalice of the Void, obviously noticeable mainly against Cascade decks, but does sometimes get brought in against decks like Burn and Hammer. So, strengths and weaknesses of the deck. Obviously, this deck has very explosive openings, is a Blood Moon deck, so it covers a lot of the ground of, mid-range deck, explosive opening. Very few things are very good against that. Very few decks are very good at recovering from being double Thoughtseized on turn 1 or having 8 power in play on turn 1. Decks that do, decks like Omnath Pile, decks like Tron, if they can get the ball rolling with having a dismember for your first play or two. But other than that, you kind of check the boxes against most combo decks. You kind of check the boxes against, most kind of other mid-range strategies. With obviously your little bit of weakness to things like Living End, which plays both well off the top because of all of its cycling, and also if you don't have your graveyard hate pieces, they can just overwhelm your board presence and kind of negate what you do well. Another deck that used to be sometimes very good against this and it's kind of faded a little bit is Boros Burn. That's because this deck does a little bit of damage to itself with its mana base. It doesn't have the fastest clock if it doesn't have a turn 1 Fury. Obviously Ragavan can be a nuisance, but they do have the hard counter to the deck in the form of Sanctifier and Vec. And one of the other cards that have started to pop up a little bit to fight against this, especially on the mirror match, is Phyrexian Crusader. Because the vast majority of the removal spells are red, so protection from red creatures can be relevant, but that is Rakdos Scam. We'll take a look at the variants of number 2 deck, 4-color Omnath. So 4-color Omnath is kind of the hard counter to Rakdos Scam. Although Scam can certainly win the matchup, it's not a hopeless matchup by any means, but in order to beat Scam, you have to be able to weather the early storm and then outgrind them late, is basically the best way to do it. Or, if you're a deck like Burn, you deal enough damage to them with your early plays and then try to buy enough time to deal that last 6 or 8 points of damage, by top decking a Boros Charm and a Bolt or something. But Omnath is a little bit better at executing their plan because, they have things like Solitude and Leyline Binding to answer that early Scam or Fury, while also having things like Bolt and Wrenn and 6 to answer cards like Ragavan. So what else this deck does well is, it first got a boost with the One Ring. Obviously, the very powerful card out of Lord of the Rings. A lot of people thought this card should be banned. It's kind of fallen off in some ways. The meta is largely adapted to it, and only a few decks really run it. 4-color Omnath, Tron, Amulet. There are a few others that can, but those are the main ones that carry the torch of the One Ring. But the deck fell off after that. People figured out how to fight against it again, much like they did before or after Urion got banned, so the deck kind of fell off. But a new contender arose, and that is Up the Beanstalk from Wilds of Eldraine. This is kind of an innocuous 2-mana enchantment from Eldraine. Comes into play, draws a card, and then for every 5-mana value spell you cast, you draw a card. Well, when your deck's packing things like Solitudes, Furies, Leyline Bindings, and even potentially something like Prismatic Ending if you do it for 5, you're going to draw a lot of cards, and that kind of mitigates even more, pitch casting your elementals in your early turns, and you're already a deck that's playing a bunch of, card advantage with Wrenn and 6, Teferi, the One Ring, Elesh Norn being relevant in the mirror match and against Scam. So a lot of different things have combined to make this deck the number 2 deck in the format again, but mainly the fact that it is almost the hard counter to Rakdos Scam, sorry. Sideboard, second copy of Elesh Norn, once again, pretty good in the mid-game against Scam, pretty good against decks like the mirror match, especially shutting down the ETB effects. Obsidian Charmaw, this is mainly your counter to one of the decks that goes over the top of you, that being Green Tron. Can also come in as a little bit of a slower hedge in the mirror match. and against decks like Amulet, but mainly this is here for Tron. Celestial Purge as, kind of a hard counter to most things out of Scam. Chalices, this deck also has a little bit of a weakness, especially to Living End. It does have a little bit of a less weakness to Rhinos, but still helps out in those matchups. Dovin's Veto when you need to counter your opponent's key spell, primarily against combo or control mirrors. And then Endurance comes in. It's good against Murktide, good against Living End. It's just a solid overall good card, but maybe not good enough to be in the main deck. Alright, taking a look at... Well, one thing I did want to mention about the first version. You're playing 4 copies of Delighted Halfling. This helps with your early mana acceleration and also makes counterspells considerably worse, which helps in the matchups like Izzet Murktide decks that are heavily reliant on counterspells. Now, this version, a little bit different, but basically the main deck is almost card for card the same, except you're no longer running Delighted Halfling. Instead, you're running a little bit more lands. You're also running a little bit more interactions. Sometimes you'll see Stern's Golding, sometimes Spell Pierce, sometimes Counterspell. In these style of builds, a little less room for Counterspell now that you have 4 copies of the Beanstalk, and you're just very clearly kind of this mid-range board control deck. Still haven't talked about Omnath, but Omnath helps offset the life loss of the One Ring, and kind of makes this deck very much a grind fest that decks like Blue-White Control have been kind of pushed out of the format in favor of this being the true control deck of the format. Sideboard, you see a lot of the same things. You see Flusterstorms to help fight over the Cascade decks, as opposed to something like Chalice, Dovin's Veto. A lot of these cards we've already kind of covered. Force of Vigor, good against decks like Hammer, good against decks like Amulet and Tron. Bosage used to pair with the ones in the main deck, helps to fight against Tron and such. Maybe not as good as Obsidian Charmaw, but still fairly solid. Curse Totem, activated abilities of creatures can't be activated. So there's one card, I forget the name of it, that's come out that is basically you target things in your graveyard, you exile them, all your creatures get the activated abilities of that creature. It's really helped push Hardened Scales back into being a top tier deck. It helps with decks like Yawgmoth, turning basically any one of your creatures into Yawgmoth's activated abilities. So Curse Totem makes a lot of sense. There aren't too many activated abilities in some of the top decks of the format other than the 2 that I just talked about, but still good hedge to have against. Sundering Titan, very good in the mirror match, blowing up 3 or 4 of your opponent's lands, sending them back to the Stone Age. Another card you sometimes see in these matchups is Emrakul the Promised End, being able to mind control your opponent for a turn, making their life absolutely miserable. And one of the things you get from not having Delighted Halfling in your deck is the ability to play a Companion. Kira, not the most impactful, but it is a card you can pitch to Endurance and Solitude, and also helps to pump your team just a tiny little bit with all the elementals you have going on. One final subvariant that's kind of taken off a little bit, and that is elementals with Time Warp. It adds a little bit of a dimension to the deck. One of the things this deck can struggle with sometimes is converting into closing speed. You have this grindy plan, but sometimes you struggle a little bit to close out the game in a quick, timely fashion. Especially if you're against decks like Tron, or decks like that can have a top deck that are just absolutely devastating. Time Warp kind of helps you to close the deal against those style of matchups, while also allowing you to accrue additional advantage, say in the mirror match. This sideboard a little bit different. Narset. Not entirely sure what matchup you want this in. Probably the mirror match, ironically, because it really shuts down up the Beanstalk. You have a good amount of non-creature spells defined, like the One Ring, Teferi, Time Warp in any of your removal spells, so fairly solid in that. Alpine Moon, kind of okay against Tron, good against Urza's Saga. It's a little bit harder to play Blood Moon in a deck like this. Now, certainly in the past, when this deck had access to something like Arkham's Astrolabe, Blood Moon was certainly on the table, but as is, it's a solid card. Veil of Summer helps to fight against counter spells and discard spells. And then, your Besiege used to help fight Tron. And the rest of the deck we've already kind of talked about. One of Supreme Verdict, help recover against a fast start, say out of Hammer or Rakdos Scam. But this is the number 2 deck in the format. How to attack this deck? Basically do something that it doesn't interact with. So, decks like Living End, decks like Tron, basically decks that are either ignoring what it's doing or just going over the top of what they're doing. And sometimes you can go under it, especially with a deck like Burn, although Burn does have weaknesses to, Teferi, Time Rattler, Solitude, and Omnath, basically life gain. So you do have kind of a plan for that matchup, but it is certainly a deck that can get under you and cause a lot of problems. Third up is Rhinos. Now, for a bit, 4-color Rhinos kind of made a bit of a comeback, but Temur is back to being the dominant thing. The deck has picked up a couple of new tech pieces, so to speak. The first one being Mutavault and Flames of Anor. While this does make your mana base a little bit worse, what this allows you to do is have this incredibly powerful 3-mana value play. So you're no longer playing things like Prismari Command or many copies of, Dead Gone. I guess not Dead Gone, but you're not playing as many copies of things like Brazen Burrow or Bone Crusher Giant. Instead, you're playing Flames of Anor. This basically is a kill target Sheoldred or anything smaller than Sheoldred, kill target artifact, like if your opponent's main boarding things like Chalice or anything, or it can just be a decent card advantage spell. And if you're in the mid game and have a Mutavault, you can tap the Mutavault to activate itself, hard cast Flames, get 2 modes out of it, and then you're kind of really pulling ahead against a deck that will sometimes struggle with card advantage battles. The rest of the deck, nothing too fancy. You've seen a bunch of main deck Mystical Disputes and Forces of Negation. This helps fight over mirror matches, things like Living End, etc., as well as decks like Murktide. Can also be decent against 4-color Omnath. And then you have your Cascade spells, and then some number of Murktide Region have kind of been the nice closer of the deck. A newer addition to the deck has been either Questing Beast or Bone Crusher Giant. These cards don't really feel modern power level in a lot of cases, but the reason they exist is basically a way to punch through the One Ring. While you can't target your opponent, you can, damage prevention with Stomp by hitting one of your own creatures or your face. And then Questing Beast just basically says ignored combat damage can't be prevented as a way to punch through your opponent. Say they play the One Ring to try to stabilize. You cast this, all of a sudden they're in a lot of trouble. Subtlety, a way to fight over Teferis in the main deck, as well as potentially keep your opponent from scamming you on turn 1 if you're against Rakdos Sack. Sideboard, more copies of Flames of Anor, anti-hate card, card advantage card, pretty solid overall. Gemstone Caverns, speed you up when you're on the draw. Brazen Bar, all-around decent card, allows you to play a little bit of a flash game while also having a little bit more anti-hate cards. Able to bounce a Teferi, able to bounce Chalice, Void Mirror, etc. Commandeer basically says take control of target the One Ring. Also can be relevant against Tron if they're trying to cast things like Ugin, etc. out of your deck. Fury, way to fight the creature decks. Decks like Hammer, decks like Burn, decks like Yawgmoth, etc. Gives you a little bit of more removal. Endurances helps to fight against Living End, which is one of this deck's major weaknesses. Now, Rhinos is a staple of the format by some, and is considered to have a very good scan or a decent scan matchup. I'm not sure how it stacks up against Omnath because I haven't played the Rhinos Omnath matchup enough to know personally, and it's not really a deck that I've concentrated a lot of playtime on. But I would suspect that matchup's a little bit of a struggle if you can't get early pressure and your opponent manages to stabilize. So I could see, needing things like Flames of Anor and stuff to help grind those matchups. Another card that used to help in that style of matchup was Blood Moon. And to that end, in this version, obviously you'll see a copy of Magus of the Moon, so that can help swing that matchup. Commandeer obviously helps steal the One Ring. Force of Vigor, similar to Flames of Anor, is kind of your anti-hate card thing. Also can come in against decks like Amulet and Tron, help slow them down. Brotherhood's End either blows up a bunch of artifacts, like say out of Hardened Scales or Affinity, or can just wipe the board against a lot of the smaller creature decks. Obviously, Furies we've already kind of covered. Obsidian Charmaw, it's very similar to what you see out of the 4-color Omnath deck. This is mainly to attack Tron. And then, Endurance, Murktide, etc. So, another addition to this deck, I shouldn't gloss over this one, is Lorien Revealed. It allows you to play a little bit less lands in your deck, while also having this good kind of mid-refueling thing. Because a lot of times, especially in attrition matchups or mirror matches, you can like exchange pairs of Rhinos, and all of a sudden it's like who top decks the most relevant card next, whether it be a large Murktide Regent. Well, Lorien Reveal gives you a split suspend one, or pay one, go get a land, or this ability to draw 3 cards in the mid game. All of that can be relevant in a deck that doesn't really have a ton of card advantage other than the Rhinos themselves. Number 4 on the list, and this has been a deck that was the number 1 deck coming out of Lord of the Rings Weekend 1, then kind of fell off a little bit. Now it's kind of come back to be kind of the middle of the pack of Tier 1, and that is Living End. Now, Living End is a deck that has pretty reasonable matchups against 4-color Omnath, is okay against Scam, and pretty good against Rhinos. So positioning-wise, it's quite well placed in the format, at least among the top decks. The one thing this deck has always kind of struggled with is the game 1s are usually pretty decent, but game 2 and game 3 kind of play this like shuffle game of what hate cards do your opponents have, what anti-hate cards you have. It's basically become the Dredge when Dredge had Faithless Looting of the format. Now, the most recent addition to the deck, in addition to the Oliphant Generous Ant serving similar to Lorien Revealed, is the inclusion of some numbers of Fury in the main deck. Now, Fury is a card that you can actually cast, unlike, say, Grief, and it helps to clear your opponent's board in the early turns. It helps to kill an early Ragavan, helps to kill, a Dothy Voidwalker. A lot of things that just, in the early turns, can cause you a lot of problems. Historically, Living End always played, what was the name of the card? There was an Evoke Elemental that allowed you to come in and kill target non-black, artifact creature. I'm drawing a blank on what it is. But basically, Fury is kind of taking the place of that, and allowing you to have early plays while also, doing a lot better in terms of another card that you can pitch and can bring back, clear your opponent's board if they happen to bring anything back. But I understand the theory behind it, but it can be a little bit difficult to cast. One thing I do like about this list is a lot of these decks run the 1-of Sunken Ruin. Now, Sunken Ruin's a fine card, don't get me wrong, but I think Urborg accomplishes what you want a lot better, and being, a colored mana source that can cast your Griefs, cast your Straight Race, and, you don't have to filter anything through it, so that, kind of problem goes out the window. Sideboard, a lot of it is just what hate cards do you expect to fight. Subtlety helps to fight against early Scam creatures, also helps to fight against Teferi. Brazen Borrower, nice catch-all, much like how it is out of the Rhinos deck. Endurance, Graveyard Nonsense, helps to fight against Murktide. Foundation Break and Force of Vigor, ways to fight through Chalice of the Void, Void Mirror, anything of that ilk. So that is the main thing, and then we'll take a look at the more traditional. This is the kind of more traditional Living End. You're not going to see any Furies in the main deck here. You will see more copies of Grief and Subtlety as ways. Grief is a nice way to punch through your opponent's hate cards. Force of Negation. The one thing these versions seem to be giving up is the ability to have Mystical Dispute in the main deck, so you're a little less resilient against counterspells, but I don't think that's as much of a problem in the format, as really the only top 5 deck that really plays a ton of counterspells right now would obviously be Murktide, and a little bit of Rhinos. So, Force of Negation maybe not quite as important, but still Living End, cascading into your Living End, kind of your general game plan. Sideboard, Leylines, and Endurances, kind of the mirror match, also decent against Scam and Murktide. Subtleties, Force of Negation, Subtlety, Brazen Borrower, Mystical Dispute, good against counterspells. Another one that I've seen from time to time is Inevitable Betrayal. Now, Inevitable Betrayal is a bit of a weird one. Search target opponent's library for a creature card, put that card on the battlefield under your control, then that player shuffles. So, the only deck I can think of, and the only deck I've seen this really effectively against, is Tron. Now, Tron, Wormcoil engines, those kind of things, but going and getting an Ulamog on turn 3, pretty hard for Tron to come back to, especially as they've cut back on Karn Liberateds. If you're taking the only copy of Ulamog, well, that's usually GG, especially if they're have all these graveyard hate cards, and all of a sudden you're taking this 10/10 indestructible Milia for 20 out of their deck. But it does take up a couple sideboard slots, but it is a very powerful thing to be doing. The final piece of the format, so to speak, the top 5 is Murktide. Now, Murktide has slid a little bit, but still, one of the top decks in the format. It's gotten preordained. It's gotten Stern Scolding in recent printings. Mainly, it just comes down to, are you running subtleties or are you running copies of Ledger Shredder? Now, this is the same deck we've all come to know and love, or know and loathe over the last, year and a half. Ragavan, DRC, Murktide Regent, early threats, late game hammer, efficient counter spells, best card selection in the format, spell piercing counter spell to back it all up, along with Bolt and Unholy Heat. Deck is very much like Rakdos Scam in that the 54, 56 cards are almost set, and then that last 3 or 4 cards, whether you're running Ledger Shredders or Subtleties or Stern Scoldings or, these like little moving pieces like a 1-of Force of Negation. A lot of it just comes down to personal preferences, but with this deck, you're going to see even 1 or 2 cards a lot, so it does matter a lot. Now, this deck is okay against Scam, really at least a slight dog to 4-color Omnath, so its positioning isn't the best currently, but still fairly solid, reasonable deck, and can give you a lot of looks at different cards. Sideboard, you're going to see a myriad of different things. Dress Down for Urza's Saga tokens, shutting down elementals. Mystical Disputes to fight over counterspells. Same thing with Flusterstorm to help fight over counterspells, cascade spells, etc. Alpine Moon and Blood Moon for Urza's Saga, greedy mana bases, etc. Cast in the Fire is a hard counter to One Ring. Brotherhood's End as, good against Hammer, good against Hardened Scales, Affinity, Furies. Same reason you like to have it again in the Rakdos Evoke deck. It's very good against decks like Yawgmoth and Affinity and Hardened Scales. Well, a little bit less against Hardened Scales, but Unlicensed Hearse for any type of graveyard nonsense. Engineered Explosives for, things like Sanctifier and Vec, things like Urza's Saga tokens, things like Rhinos tokens, 1 mana plays out of your opponent, etc. Also good against Chalice. So, lots of options for the Murktide deck. And finally, some copies of Ledger Shredder in this version. A little bit weaker against cards like Bowmaster, but still helps you see a lot of the cards that you're looking for. The cards in the sideboard are pretty much all the same. It's just a matter of where you're positioning the cards. Are you running Blood Moon over Alpine Moon? But basically, the main debate with Murktide right now is whether you're running some copies of Ledger Shredder or if you're running probably another copy or 2 of Subtlety. Really minor decisions in the grand scheme of things, but it does help to have sometimes those extra threats in some of the grindier matchups or matchups where you find yourself taking out Ragavan because Ragavan's never going to connect. But that is a long-winded way of talking about the top 5 decks of the format. Now, decks that are right outside the format, Hardened or outside the top 5, Hardened Scales, decks like Amulet Titan, Yawgmoth, Hammer, to a lesser extent Burn, Tron. All these decks have a place in the format, but these are really the top echelon of the format. You can play maybe some of the 3 or 4 or 5 other decks and expect to do reasonably well, but as long as Scam is at the top of the format is very, Scam and Omnath really kind of dictate around what the rest of the format rotates. You have obviously the Cascade decks and then Murktide now, but it's kind of where the format is. So, that's kind of a good overview of where the modern format is a little bit after Wilds of Eldraine released, as we're going into October, about another month and a half away before I think spoiler season for the next, or maybe in the next couple weeks, the next spoiler season starting. But Modern's in a stable, if a little bit stale place right now. I know a lot of people have talked about Rakdos Scam getting something banned, but if the deck is, I don't think the deck is too overpowered, but maybe it is a little too represented right now. But it is certainly a powerful deck that got the powerful tool of Orcish Bowmasters, and it solved a lot of the deck's weaknesses. So if you like this kind of modern content, especially if you're a beginner or an intermediate for the modern format, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. In addition to that, this month we'll be working on beginner's guides to the Modern format. We've already started our series on the Modern ban list. We're going to be doing a little bit of a deeper dive into Rakdos Scam, whether it be a little bit more gameplay, mulligan guides, how to build a sideboard with a deck, not necessarily how to truly sideboard like an expert, but at least give you some idea of what cards go in, what cards go out in certain matchups. But that's going to be the main thing for the month of October. So if you look forward to those kind of videos, don't forget to subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.